They told the story at wakes and on porch stoops, between the clink of teacups and the slump of tired shoulders. A story that looked small enough to fit the valley's breath and large enough to make children sleep with the curtains tucked tight. Once, long before the blueprints of Grayfen were inked into parish records, there was an alpha who kept his pack by law and ledger. He kept the borders between human and wild with a hand as firm as a smith's. The ancient pact said, "Protect the people, respect the markers, take no more than your hunger requires." The pact required balance. The alpha broke it. Whether by stubbornness, by grief that had not been healed, or by a single choice meant to save one face among many, he tipped the scale. He took more. Legends argued the reason as if argument could soften the fact. The hollowed court, old as stone and older than mercy, bound his fate with a verdict that was both simple and cruel. Keep what you have loved, and bear the memory of it until your heart is worn thin as rope. Live beyond the span allotted to men. Remember every loss. Wear the wound as a lamp. So he walked the ridgelines of Grayfen Valley with a grief in his throat, an endless tally of names under his tongue. His pack scattered like leaves in a storm. Some fled to other shadows. Some turned on themselves, some died. He remained. An alpha with no home that fit him, a guardian hollowed by immortality. People swore they saw him only when the valley breathed hardest, when a widow's keening split the night, when a child was lost to the river, when grief rose like smoke. They said the alpha walked when grief cried loud enough. The story softened into rumor and then into the town's business. Mothers used it like a threat. Stay indoors or the alpha will take you, and bakers used it like a lullaby. He who keeps watch will not let wolves in. Hunters left offerings at stone cairns, and old women muttered prayers at the edges of the woods. But every telling carried the same sorrow. The alpha was no simple beast to be slain, no villain with a snarl. He was a thing of duty and regret. He protected the valley because he could not do anything else. In the end, the legend was not a warning so much as a promise. The valley kept its own. And when someone's grief burned brighter than their life, the alpha would come not to console, not to claim, but to stand in the dark beside the living and the dead. He carried with him the weight of many yesterdays, and his steps were the sound of time that would not loosen its grip. On certain nights, if you walked the outer road and kept the moon behind your shoulder, you might see a silhouette stop at a widow's window and listen. The figure would turn once toward the woods, as though answering a summons no one else heard, a patient sentinel, forever learning what it cost to be bound to memory. Evelyn Marlowe's house sat on the road's last curve, where cobbles surrendered to mud and the town's light thinned into tree shadows. It was a small house, 2 rooms, a lean pantry, a stitch of garden where she coaxed stubborn herbs from soil that complained. The roof had one stubborn leak she never quite fixed because the sound of water at night became a companion for her sleep. Her fingers, stained with thread and seam press, knew how to remake things to look whole again, though the seams they sewed were not always for fabric. She had been 32 the winter the fever took Adrian. That number felt precise and useless in the long months that followed. People offered condolences that were pained and polite, a repetition of ritual meant to seal a wound with words. Neighbors pressed casseroles into her arms. The town offered its pity like a cheap shawl, necessary, awkward, and not the warmth she wanted. Evelyn understood how pity could be kind and small. She accepted the casseroles, repaid the favors, kept to her routines. Grief became a worn garment she could fold into the chest, and only open when night made the house feel too large. At work she mended collars for ministers, knitted caps for children whose cheeks reddened in cold, sewed linings into coats that would not keep out the wind. In the light, she could be exacting and practical. In the dark, her mind rewound to small moments. The way Adrian would hum off-key at the sink, the particular tilt of his laugh. Those recollections were not mournful in a way she recognized. They were anchor points that kept the ground from pulling out from under her feet. People said she was quiet but strong, like old oak with a respectable number of knots. She did not court company. She did not trade confidences. But she did not shun kindness either. Miriam Hargrove, an old woman with a shawl full of secrets, would sit and tell her stories, offer poultices, and teach her the names of healing roots. The children waved. The baker nodded. Life, stubborn as a weed, continued. Evelyn's grief became a part of her, folded into daily rhythms, not a furnace of agony, but a steady, humming ache like the seamstress's machine. There were tells around the house that made the town murmur in small ways. Someone scratched the door in late autumn, claw marks, shallow but deliberate, as if a thing knocked and then thought better. Once, in spring, she found tracks in the garden, prints deep and odd, too swift and clean for a dog, leading to the hedgerow and then stopping as if whatever made them decided not to return. Lamps flickered when she walked by. Children made up rhymes with her name in them that sounded both endearing and slightly fearful. Evelyn noticed these things, catalogued them like stitches to be made later, but she did not let the unease alter her days. The house listened, she thought. Sometimes, in that listening, the corners rearranged themselves into memories she did not summon. A cupboard would open at night. A window would fog as if from breath that did not belong to her. Once, kneeling to thread a hem by candlelight, she felt a presence at the window like a patient animal waiting its turn. Her heart smoothed, then tightened. She told herself it was wind, or memory, or her own longing. The human mind, she knew, was adept at making patterns where none existed. Patterns were easier to mend than void. Still, when the moon set silver against the trees and the valley seemed to hold its breath, Evelyn would wake from sleep with her palms pressing into the sheet as if they had been pushed by someone's hand. She often dreamed of wolves that cried under a blood moon, not hungry howls, but something like a translation of sorrow into sound. She would carry the echo with her through the day. At market, people looked at her with a softness that was almost reverence. Others looked with the quick avoidance of those who fear being reminded of their own losses. She never expected a man at her doorstep on a night when rain tried to teach the world the language of ruin. It began with a knock like a bone against wood, urgent and uneven. Evelyn had been at the sewing machine, working a hem by the guttering light, when the sound startled her so that the thread snapped. Outside, rain threaded the world into blur. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and went to the door. The lamplight spilled, a small pool against the steps. There he lay, a man curled on the threshold with the rain running through his hair, face angled to the sky as if he was both pleading and listening. He was not of the town at first glance. His coat was woven in a pattern she had seen only in the North markets, the fabric thick and lined with odd sigils, stitched where one would not expect decoration. His hands were large and raw. His mouth was a slow, careful tremor. Where his chest showed through the open coat, there were marks, deep slashes like someone dragged iron across skin, old and red and foolishly precise. Evelyn's first movement was practical: lift, warm, shelter. She pulled him inside with surprising strength, set a chair by the hearth, and got a bowl of hot broth. She worked without questions, because action carved a smaller space for worry. The man's eyes opened once, and for a moment she thought he might be blind. They held a color she had only ever seen in stray optical glass, a gold softened by stormlight. When he spoke, it was a voice that had been sleeping for too long. "You should not have helped me," he said, each word a measured weight. "They will scent you now." Evelyn's skin prickled, of a fear that did not belong to simple rumor. "Who are they?" she asked, though she knew the town's imagination had names for shadow things. The man tried to sit and flinched as if the motion cost him bone. He let out a breath and tried again. "Names do not always make things safer." He looked at her as if cataloging the house, the broth, the plainness of her hands. "My name is Alaric Thorne." The name landed like something that had been waiting. Evelyn watched him with the odd calm of someone who has sewn many seams. The patient assessment, the quick measuring of angles and safety. She fetched linen to bind the wounds along his ribs. The cloth soaked dark and refused to lie flat. Beneath the torn flesh, she could see muscle braided with something that did not quite look like scar tissue, like old silvered rope woven with red. There were other things. When he shifted, the room's mirror dimmed a degree, as if the glass did not know whether to show him. The candlelight moved away from him with a shiver. Outside, a dog in the lane started and began to whine, a long, plaintive thread that went through the house and back out again. Evelyn's heart thudded, a steady, reassuring drum she clung to. "You're hurt badly," she said. "What happened?" Alaric's laugh was a dry sound, broken like winter branches. "What happens in the wild seldom consults us first," he said. "I fought something that should not have been in our midst. I fought my own past. The marks are reminders." He pinched the edge of a bandage and winced, but his eyes were steady on hers. "Do not," he coughed. "Do not let them make you afraid of me." She wanted to ask what they would do, who hunted him, but the storm made speech cumbersome and sharp. She instead offered a bowl and sat across from him, watching the way his jaw worked, how the candlelight traced a faint map of scars on his face. When he closed his eyes, his breathing carried the faint suggestion of wolf breath, not animal in the crude sense, but layered with an echo, as if another life folded within his ribs. In those small, breathless moments, Evelyn felt the old stories press against the walls of her daily life. The claw marks on her door, the tracks in the garden, the way the children had stopped running past her house at dusk. They became part of a larger pattern she could no longer dismiss. And Alaric, with his gold-soft eyes and his voice that carried the weight of roads lived and relived, was not merely a stranger. He was a fracture through which a story she had only half remembered slipped. "Why me?" she asked before she could stop herself. "Why come here?" Alaric opened his eyes, and for the first time they softened in a way that ate at the armor around his words. "Grief draws him in," he said. "He comes when grief calls. You have been calling Evelyn Marlowe. I heard the song from the road." The name, spoken and known, made her toes go cold. She had not told anyone the tightness that sometimes squeezed her throat in the night, the echo of a husband's laughter that rolled in on winter wind. She had not told him, and yet he spoke it like a latch opening. In the hearth's dim, with rain like punctuation outside, a man who smelled faintly of pine and old wounds had claimed the truth of her nights. "You should leave," she said, though her hands did not move to the door. "If they're hunting you, they will not find what they cannot smell," Alaric replied, and then, with a softness that was almost apology, "You should not have helped me." Evelyn thought of the stitches she had made that day, of the collars she would mend tomorrow, of the small acts of repair that tethered her to ordinary living. Helping someone was a stitch she could not unmake. She covered his hand with her own and felt the tremor there was not only from pain, but from an ache as old as winter. Outside, the wind learned how to carve the house in sharper lines, and the valley listened, as it always did, to the beginning of something that would not be undone by a single night. For the first week, the house seemed to breathe around Alaric in a way it had never done for Evelyn. Her rooms had always been small, honest things. A bed that creaked in the same places every winter, a table scarred from years of knives and pins, a tea kettle that whistled like a querulous neighbor. Now the air carried another rhythm, the soft sound of a man settling himself into pain, of a wound learning its edges and then learning to be patient. Alaric slept most of the day and woke at odd hours, as if his body kept a time zone of its own. When he moved, even the floorboards seemed to make a respectful silence. He was careful with the cups and the cloth, with the way he folded his hands. There was a steadiness about him that felt like the low tide, relentless, inevitable, shaping the shore. Evelyn pegged it to discipline at first, a soldier's courtesy, perhaps, but later she understood it was a different sort of training, the long education of someone who had learned to count losses like pebbles. She learned his habits by watching them the way a tailor learns the line of a garment. Subtle, exact, reverent. He rinsed the bandages in cool water and laid them on a line by the window to dry. He would sit facing the door, head lowered, as if he thought he might recognize a particular silhouette before it crossed the threshold. He kept his voice low, as though loud sounds might fracture him. When conversations wandered to the ordinary, weather, bread, town gossip, Alaric answered with a distasteful bemusement, like a man who once had a kingdom and now had to ally with small things. The house itself behaved oddly in his presence. Mirrors fogged in patterns that could be traced like new maps. Frost crept across the inside of the front pane at the edges, feathering in delicate designs that mimicked fern fronds. Once, Evelyn watched a bloom of frost appear and then be pried away from the glass, as if an invisible hand had smoothed it. The hearth flame would dip when he entered and rise when he left, like a shy animal that trusted him enough to return. Tracks were the most curious thing. In the early mornings, after nights of heavy rain, she found prints at the threshold, deep, elongated, the toes splayed in a way no dog's paw would allow. They led into the garden and then stopped, as if someone had thought better of walking into the hedgerow. Once she followed them further, through the wet grass and to the tree line, where they fractured into a series of depressions as if the creature had crouched and listened. There was no scent she could place to them, only a sense in the air like the static before a storm. Alaric spoke to her about things that made her think of time and its cruelty. "Once," he said one dusk, "a pack is more than its members." He folded his hands around a mug and watched the steam vanish. "You learn names and the shapes they make in the dark. You learn who will come back for you and who will not. The rest is raw bone." Evelyn thought of Adrian like a photograph left too long in the sun. The edges curled, the middle bleached out. She answered with the things she knew how to say. "We keep what we can, we mend what comes apart." "It is not the same," Alaric whispered. "A man can mend a coat. A wolf cannot sew a heart." There was something about the way he said wolf, not as a confession, but as a fact that made the room tilt. She had been wary then of superstitions. Practical things had always steadied her. Yet the house listened, as it always did, and kept the small intimacies alive. She found herself telling him things she had not told others. The way she sometimes held Adrian's shirt to her face and let the scent of him pretend he was present. The odd, small comforts that kept her going, the making of jam at dawn, the habit of leaving an extra slice of bread for the child who delivered milk. Alaric listened with the distance of one who had been untied from ordinary attachment. "I remember names," he said once, eyes like burnished coins. "I remember the sound their names made when the wind stole them away. It is less for me to hold than it once was. I keep remembering until remembering is its own kind of punishment." He did not talk of his pack's final days with any flourish. Instead, he mentioned small collapses, the trivial moments that become grotesque in the telling. "We argued over a fox," he said, and a beat later, "I argued over a face I loved." He would stop himself then, fingers tightening, and the shape of his jaw would make a map of what he refused to say. One night, as wind scraped the shutters and a storm made the road outside a shining river, Evelyn found him half standing at the window, one hand on the sill as if to steady the world. Moonlight filtered through the clouds and painted the inside of the room in a silver that did not quite belong to the lamp. He turned, and his expression had the acute sharpness of some recalled pain. "You will have to know," he said, voice small and raw, "that some wounds do not knit." He touched the place near his ribs where the bandage sat like a promise. "There is a bullet there, silver. It keeps finding me." Evelyn reached out, not sure whose skin she expected, rough or warm, human or otherwise. His hand was calloused, the sinews like rope beneath skin. She felt the irregularity beneath the bandage, a tiny coolness that did not match the warmth of flesh. "Why not let me look?" she asked. "Because some things are meant to be left as they are," he answered. He met her gaze, and for a moment the distance vanished. "Because when people find out, they either try to fix them or they try to finish them." The last word landed like a stone. She understood the shape of both options in a way that had nothing to do with fantasies. In her youth, she'd seen men tuck danger away with a ritual of denial and hasty wink. In the town, certain weapons were problem solvers. She had no wish to be the instrument of anyone's final solution. She bound the bandage more firmly, feeling a tremor beneath. Not just his pain, but an old, corrosive memory that made him flinch even at kindness. "What is it like?" she asked in a voice that surprised her, "to be bound to memory forever?" He looked at her like a man watching rain right on a window. "It is the worst weather," he said. "You never get a day that is not gray. You hold yesterday in the center of your chest, and it will not stop bleeding." They shared a silence afterward that filled the room like a second presence. The house listened like a thing that keeps confessions in its beams. The ordinary world, market days, the church bell, the baker's early whistle, went on as if these private reckonings were a different kind of weather. Outside, the hedgerow whispered with the steady, patient patience of the wild. Inside, two people who had known loss sat within its small, warm geography and counted what remained. The moon that month was a careful thing. It rose like a slow promise, and hung with a pale deliberation over the valley. It filled the hedgerow with silver lace and turned the pond to a sheet of startled glass. Evelyn had slept poorly, the way people do when the past has found a rhythm that insists on repeating itself. She woke to a sound that was not relentingly human. It began as a murmur, deep and layered, a chorus of guttural notes that crawled along the rafters. Then came the snarl, a sound that braided pain with ancient muscle memory. Her breath stopped. She padded barefoot to the window and peered out into the pale world. Alaric stood in her garden, shoulders heaving. The rain had ceased. The air smelled of wet earth and pine resin. He was naked to the waist, the bandage on his ribs loosened, and moonlight showed the tense architecture of his muscles as if a sculptor had carved him anew. The sight of him, fragile in the way of a carved thing, made a tenderness rise in her like heat. Then the change began. It was not the theatrical contortion the tailies promised. There were no brilliant rays of night, nor a cloud of glorified fur. The transformation was a slow tearing. Alaric's jaw slid and reshaped like a panel being forced out of a frame. His fingers convulsed and rick-knuckled into something both familiar and wrong. His spine arched as if to rearrange the world along new axes. Pain drew fine white lines across his face. Veins stood proud, lit like ink bleeds under the skin. Evelyn's heart wanted to scream, to call for a doctor, for help that did not exist in the kind of night that bred folklore. Instead, she moved to the door and opened it. The air that met her was a wash of ozone and dust, and something that made the back of her throat tighten. He looked up as if the motion alone had anchored him for a second. When his eyes met hers, they were wolf and man at once, bright, horrified, and hungry. The sound he made was an animal's noise braided with a man's regret. He attempted a step forward and stumbled, then lurched away. Long-haired fur peeled from the seams of his shirt like a curtain torn from a rod. His hands lengthened into claws, webbed and precise as mallet shadows. Moonlight crowned him with something terrible and exquisite. Evelyn did not close her mouth. She had, in her younger years, seen animals killed and butchered, and had learned that the spectacle of pain did not call for applause but for steady hands. She remembered the smell of Adrian's fever, and the way small, sensible actions did more good than flattery. So she kept her feet planted and watched. If horror can be transformed into pity, it is by the act of watching someone suffer without relief. Alaric's face flickered between feral and human. In one blink, he was a memory of a man she had been leaning into, and in the next he was a snout, a muzzle lifting to the moon. The sound his throat made shifted into notes she recognized from the dream songs she'd heard months earlier. The plaintive, impossible cry of wolves that grieve not for hunger, but for things lost. He sensed her presence fully then. Muscles twitched, the wolf's side searching for scent for prey, for a map of the night. He opened his maw and a low, involuntary growl rolled out. It was a warning and a plea. His ears pin-snap alert, he turned toward the hedgerow as if seeking escape. Whatever animal lived inside wanted the forest. The human inside wanted someone to catch him before he plunged into something irrevocable. Alaric, Evelyn said, her voice small and steady against the storm of sound. Stay, don't go. For a breath he hesitated, the wolf and the man weighing each other in the balance. Then he snarled again, not at her, but at something she could not see. The sound hardened to resolve. He stepped backward and then broke from the garden like a dark comet, a blur against the hedgerow. Leaves tore in his wake. The last thing she saw before the trees swallowed him was the flicker of human agony in his features. And then the wolf's wild, driving hunger as he became a streak among trunks. Evelyn stood at the doorway with the linens bunched in her hand, watching the night seal itself around him. Her heart thudded like a bell in her chest. The blood left her head like a tide. She felt dizzy, then tethered by an odd clarity. Watching him change had taught her something she had not expected. There was no simple monster, only a man split by a punishment that neither time nor sorrow had forgiven. To see it was to learn that her pity might be a dangerous thing. She closed the door quietly and wrapped the bandages tighter around the wound he had left behind. A small, private ritual, the way someone might adjust a collar on a child who'd fallen asleep. The house listened and kept those actions, setting them into the memory of its beams as if to remember for her when she could not. Far from Evelyn's narrow lane and the hedgerow's wet breath, within a ring of stones older than the town's charter, The hollowed court convened where the ash trees met. Candles guttered in a hollow like graves waking. The elders sat wrapped in layers of cloth and old law. Their faces were parchment maps of displeasure. They had no affection for rumor, but they had an antiquity that smelled of salt and old promises. The messenger brought word with a winded urgency that stung the candlelight. The moonbound alpha, or someone who bore his marks, had been seen near Grayfen. An old hunting line, a scarred silhouette, a presence that drew the morning songs of the valley. The council's interest was not sentimental. The balance, they pronounced among themselves in thin voices, was a ledger with an appetite. If a being bound by the pact stirred the valley's grief, the old arrangements might fray. "This cannot be allowed," said one, his fingers stained with soot. "The pact intended limits. Memory is a tether, not a weapon." Another, whose left eye had sediment of age across it, folded his hands like a petition. "He will not be easily bowed," he said. "If he gathers the valley, we will have to act." The hollowed court's means were not subtle. They had a law that some things must end before they became contagion. They consulted ancient ink and darker memory, and their judgment was a simple, cold thing. Locate and remove the aberration before it could awaken any ancient bond that might bind human and wild anew in a way the court could not govern. So they called for revenants, hunters restored to a half-life, and a will retooled for cruelty. These were men and women with pale skin and hollowed eyes, whose hearts beat to a drum of command rather than compass. They were given blades darkened with old rites and scent smoke that could confuse a wolf's nose. Their orders were concise. Find the alpha, cut the tether, and return without question. As the court sealed the decision with a looped knot of words and ash, the valley beyond the stones seemed to hold its breath. Somewhere, in a house with a leaky roof, a woman named Evelyn folded linen and did not know the net that was being woven. Somewhere among the hedgerows, Alaric ran with the ache of the moon in his blood and the pale knowledge that the world's elders had decreed an end he might not outrun. The hollowed court's verdict was not a mercy. It was a calculation, and calculations never held tenderness. They sent men who smelled of old embers to make sure the pact did not unroll into a new chapter. The court could not close rain, had thinned to a cold memory when Alaric came back. Not like the man who had first staggered to her door, but smaller in a way that only wounds and shame can hollow a person. He leaned against her gate as if it were the last friendly thing left in the world, cloak shredded, breath ragged. Evelyn found him before she had brewed tea. The house smelled of wool and lint, and a softness of normalcy that felt like an accusation against the wild. She had not expected him to return so soon. The garden was a map of where he'd been. Torn earth, brambles thinned as if by the passage of someone who did not belong, and beneath the scattering of leaves, dark smudges that were no good for the eyes. He let himself in with no ceremony, as if the threshold had come to mean something different to both of them now. His shoulders had the acute tightness of a man whose bones were protesting. The bandage by his ribs was loosened and soaked through. Beneath the rag, the skin showed bruises like old constellations. He did not ask for anything. He sank into the chair as if he had forgotten how to stand. Evelyn moved with the economy of someone used to loss and small repairs. She set the kettle on, warmed broth, boiled herbs that Miriam had handed over in a paper parcel, and worked with her hands so the room would not know how loudly her heart had started to drum. When she bathed his wounds, her fingers were careful. The silver bullet lodged near his ribs, she had felt its evidence before. An ellipsis of cold under skin seemed angrier now, as though the world had pressed it deeper. Alaric flinched at the touch but did not close his eyes. "You should leave this time," Evelyn said, the words both practical and an attempt to control what she could not otherwise repair. The thread of scolding in her voice was like a hem, small and necessary. He laughed then, but the sound was brittle as thin ice. "You always tell me to leave," he said, and there was a small, rueful hardness around the laugh. "I keep not leaving." When he spoke of his wounds, it was in fragments that were easier to swallow than full explanations. There had been hunters, he said, but not the kind from storybooks, men whose bones had been thin enough to be hollowed by law. There had been traps and snares, and the scent of smoke used to confuse quarry. "They have learned new ways to find me," he told her. They use old hate like a lantern. Evelyn pressed cloth into the places where his skin quivered and held it until the shaking slowed. The mundane tasks, washing, binding, bringing tea, were rituals that tethered them both to a planet where gravity was still law. When the practical was done, and the room had settled into a dimness only lamplight could author, he let his head tilt back and sighed like someone who had remembered how heavy breath could be. He taught her pieces about the pack in slow, reluctant glimpses. He did not offer himself as a hero. He offered himself as a ledger of what had once been done in the name of protection and what that protection had cost. "We took too much," he said finally, the words small as a stitch. "Once, we thought being the line between wild and town meant we could decide where that line should be. We punished trespassers not only because they threatened our borders, but because we thought cutting the problem would keep the rest from bleeding. It began with foxes and goats, then men who took more than they should. It became habit." Evelyn listened. Her hands lay folded in her lap, fingers threaded through one another like thread through a needle. Memory had taught her that confessions had edges. They could cut you or mend you depending on how they were handled. She had seen men justify cruelty for reasons that read like devotion. She had seen grief harden into armor and then into a weapon. She had also felt in herself the habit of protecting what little she had left. The line between protection and possession was frighteningly narrow. "So you killed them?" she asked, and the question hung in the room like steam. "Yes," Alaric said, and there was no show of defense. There was a tiredness that made the admission small and final, like closing a drawer. "We killed when we feared. We led the pack into human places until the law of men and the law of wolves bled into one another. For a time it kept the valley from ruin, or at least that's the story I told myself. But the hallowed court does not like such stories. They called it a breach. They punished me for what I once thought was mercy." He spoke of the moonbound curse in a tone unspectacular, as if naming it more often made it less sharp. "They bound me to remember," he said. "To keep every regret as a lantern I must carry. They made me a walking ledger of loss so I could never forget. The pack scattered. Those I loved, I remember until remembering is punishment." Evelyn felt something crack in her and then fold back into a new shape. His confession did not absolve him, but it offered a ledger that could be read. She could measure the distance between his crime and the punishment, between the responsibility he had carried and the ways it had warped him. Anger rose in her, hot, bright, like the first flare of a match. He had defended territory by taking life. Those were not small things, yet beneath the anger was an odd sorrow. He had not been monstrous for the joy of it. He had been monstrous for a stubborn, misapplied kind of devotion. "Why do you still protect humans?" she asked. It was not a question of morality alone, it was a practical puzzle. Why stay near the people who would spit at the seed of what you were? Why keep risking the shelter of someone who might be the tinder for another hunt? Alaric's face softened in a movement that looked like old regret made human. His hand found hers without theatricality, no sudden grasp, only the simple fact of skin meeting skin, warm and unremarkable. "Because once," he said, and the voice held the weight of landscapes, "a woman like you forgave me, and I lost her too." The confession landed in a way both sharp and tender. Evelyn had expected to be repelled, to build a wall of righteous indignation around everything he had done. Instead, she felt the gravity of someone confessing a sin and the emptiness that followed loss. Forgiveness, it seemed, did not necessarily fix consequence. Sometimes it simply made the one who sought it smaller and more human. She did not know the woman he spoke of. The name he gave was an ache without a syllable. But the shape of that memory, a woman whose forgiveness had been enough to change a heart and then lost, was grief mirrored back to her. She understood, then, another reason he stayed near the valley. Memory was both cruelty and tether. He could not free himself from the past, even if he wanted to, because he remembered too well the faces that had looked to him for protection and the faces that had turned away. In the days that followed, Grayfen's streets acquired a tension that could be tasted between clattering cups at the inn and the thin, disapproving nods at market. Word spread in the town like a disease, picked up in low tones and prickly stares. Men who once tolerated a rumor now sharpened it into accusation. The hollowed court's decisions had seeped outward. Men with obligations to old laws put their hands together and promised to make the valley safe again. Sheriff Tomas Reed, a man with a jaw like a hinge and an eye for the severity of order, returned to his station with a purpose that looked less like duty and more like hunger. They came in the end like winter, abrupt, certain, with the flapping of cloaks and the smell of iron. Reed led a small company of hunters, men with hard faces and questions that smelled of judgment. He did not come alone. The hollowed court had sowed official whisperings into the town's gossip. Strange sightings, the smell of wolf scent on children's coats, a widow keeping secrets. Reed announced himself at Evelyn's gate with an authority the town recognized. "We've had reports of strange folk about these parts," he said, the words flat and practiced. "Have you seen anyone?" Evelyn's hands were folded in linen on the table behind her. She had known this moment might come. Pretending otherwise would have been a deceit she had no right to tell herself. Her voice was steady. "Only myself and my work," she said. The answer was small and honest, and as much a statement of craft as it was of defiance. Reed looked at her with something like impatience. "We take these things seriously. You understand. If there is any sheltering—" "There is no one here I am hiding," Evelyn said, and the linen in her hands felt heavier than cloth. She had not told them of Alaric's presence. To do so would be to sign the page that read a death sentence. Better to risk suspicion than to play the role of executor. He flicked his gaze at the cellar door, then at the window, and his eyes narrowed like a seamstress checking a seam. The men beside him shifted, the movement like rough stitches loosening. Reed forced a smile that did not meet his eyes. "We'll need to look around," he said. "We're only being cautious for everyone's sake." Evelyn's quiet reply was a small flame. "Do as you must," she said. "But if you break into my cellar, you will find nothing but preserves. If you fear wolves, you should look to the hedgerows, not my house." One of the hunters, a man with a jaw like a chop, moved toward the cellar as if the motion had been rehearsed. Evelyn's heart thumped in her throat, not from fear of what they might find, but from the knowledge of the cost she had already committed to bear. Alaric, wherever he hid below her feet, had his ear against the boards. She could imagine the scraping of his breath through the slats, the way he would flinch at each footstep. When the men pried at the latch, refusing to see her words as anything but obstinacy, she stepped forward with the calm of a woman who had measured risk her whole life. "Open it if you must," she said. Her voice did not falter. The cellar yielded to their jostling, cold air breathed up like the mouth of a well. The hunters descended with the sort of anger that had not yet been tempered by doubt. For a moment, they looked every bit like the men in stories, certain of right, oblivious to consequence. Alaric lay pressed beneath sacks of grain and jars of jam, nostrils flaring, listening to the scrape of boot and the scrape of a man's hand against the wall. He could smell them through the wood, iron and smoke and a faint mildew of old law. Every breath he took tasted like a ledger being written. He heard Reed's voice, clipped and efficient, and felt that old animal terror climb like ivy in his chest. This time it was worse. Someone might not only chase him away. Someone might end what the hollowed court had declared an aberration. Evelyn watched the men move through her cellar as though she herself were stitched into the fabric of the search. She kept her face open but guarded, like a seam that might give way if tugged too hard. The hunter with the chop jaw poked at a sack and grunted. "No sign," he said. "You keep your secrets well, widow." His tone was equal parts accusation and relief. Reed's eyes lingered on her long enough to be a measurement. "If you see anyone leave in the night," he said, "you will tell us. It's dangerous to shelter strange folk." Evelyn met his gaze. "It's dangerous to assume guilt upon rumor," she replied, "and it's cruel to set law above mercy." For a second Reed's features tightened as if poised to retort. Then he glanced at the gathered company and found the script of caution easier to adopt than the script of cruelty. "We'll be watching then," he said, and the men left with the clack of boots fading into road and rain. When the house settled back into its small, ordinary ache, Alaric crawled out from under the jam jars, his body close to trembling. He crawled to the creak of a floorboard and used the slat by the hearth to peer at them as they left, the moon haloing their retreat. He had almost betrayed himself in that cellar by the hum of his own breathing. He had almost made the mistake of stepping in to do what he thought would be right. to stand and show himself and answer for what he had done. As he raised his eyes to Evelyn, something like shame and gratitude braided together in a way that made his shoulders fold. She had lied. She had let men with harsher hearts search her home to keep him alive. For a while, he watched her hands fold the linens and the way her jaw moved when she breathed in and out. Each small movement was a ledger of courage that added to his debt. The thought of what his presence had cost her, the town's suspicion, a sheriff's scowl, made the ache in his ribs sting sharper. That night, when the moon rose thin and the house sighed into sleep, Alaric sat with Evelyn in the lamplight. Candle wax slid in small molten rivers. The hours pressed like cloth to a pattern. He looked at her with an old, blunt kindness, and something like a plan that had been practiced in the small rooms of his mind. "I will leave after the moon wanes," he said at last, the sentence shaped like a scythe cutting air. "I thought to stay until I was sure you were safe, but I have brought danger to your door." "You keep trying to protect everyone but yourself," she replied, not as reproach, but as a fact observed with the same clean eyes she used at the sewing table. Her voice carried no melodrama. It carried the steadiness of someone who had watched loss make men desperate and ruin towns. He reached across the small space between them and took her hand. The touch was not the blaze of a sudden passion. It was the merest recognition. Two people acknowledging, in the gentlest way, the truth they had been avoiding. Their fingers interlaced with the familiarity of a seam pressed between two fabrics. In that quiet, neither of them needed to speak of futures or of curses. What mattered was the sign they gave each other, that there was, in the wreckage of what had been done and lost, a mutual seeing. Outside, the hedgerow whispered with wind, and the moon kept its careful, impartial watch. Inside, by the lamplight's soft rule, two damaged people reached for a small human touch and found in it the courage to continue. Whether together or apart, snow fell in a silence that felt obscene after the day's shouting. A slow, polite shroud over a world certain of its judgment. The hunters moved like a tide through the pines, their torches painting moving saints and sinners in the trunks. They had tracked Alaric with a precision that smelled of old law. Scent smoke to confuse, iron-cold spears tipped with runes that bit at the air like small accusations. He ran with the moon pulling at him, feet beating a tired rhythm into packed drift. Each breath fogged like a small betrayal. Each step was a ledger entry he had not asked to write. They trapped him in a clearing the valley called the Black Hollow, where the trees stood like witnesses, and the snow had pooled into impossible white. The revenants emerged with the hush of things that have been practiced into cruelty, hollow faces, eyes like coin turned dull. They had the court's scent on them and the court's command, end the aberration. Alaric found himself hemmed in like a beast with a single corridor of escape. And the moon, swollen and strict, made him small in the way lantern light makes a man small on a wall. The first revenant lunged with the kind of force that was rehearsed rather than furious. It put its blade where mercy would not reach. Alaric took the strike as if it was familiar language, as if blades and he had an old conversation to finish. He moved with a speed that was less grace than the economy of one who knows all the ways to fail. Fur and flesh and the metallic stutter of ripped cloth answered. The snow drank the heat of the fight and gave none back in return. When the sheriff arrived with the town behind him, torches bobbing like anxious stars, he wanted law, not epiphany. Tomas Reed had the face of a man taught to fold doubt into duty. He had the look of someone who would cut to obtain certainty. He strode into the clearing and for a moment stood like the valley's chosen simple answer. Alaric's wolf side rose at the sight of him, nostrils flaring for scent and outrage. The revenants were fewer than the wolves in his memory, but their hunger for an end made them dangerous with an efficiency that almost matched his own. The battle was brutal and fast as winter. Alaric moved through the revenants like something made of shadow and bone, a litany of what anger did when it had somewhere to go. He tore the spell smoke from their nostrils with teeth that translated old rites into blood. The forest rang with animal sounds that were human in fury and human in pain. Bodies slid in the snow and stilled, a quickness that both relieved and terrified him. With each fall, his ribs flared like a concertina of memory. The silver bullet near his heart burned with a chill that was both threat and reminder. It hummed in his chest like an accusation from the pact. Reed, sword lifted, found himself within range of a wolf whose name was also a man. There was an instant where the thunder of two wills met, Alaric's need to end the hunters and Reed's insistence that law must be preserved by force. The wolf's jaws closed around the air where the man should have been, but the sheriff moved with the slow, terrible certainty of those who think their cause sanctified. A lunge, a stumble. The wolf reared and, in a blind moment, would have killed him if not for the thin thread of humanity that still anchored Alaric. Evelyn was there before she had planned to be, panting, snow in her lashes, the hem of her skirts freezing to the wind. She had followed the torchlight with a courage that had nothing to do with bravado and everything to do with someone who could no longer abide being the reason for another's ledger. She ran through the smoke and the tossed shadows, her voice small and sharp as a bell. "Alaric!" she cried. "Stop!" The name fell like a prayer and like a command. He paused, the motion of his limbs stuttering as if understanding the syllable required some forgotten courtesy. For a moment the wolf and the man locked eyes with the woman who had sheltered him, who had sewn bandages and told him small truths about mercy. Reed, staggered, found a pause in which to raise his weapon again. The wolf's head dipped, a war between the hungers inside taking place in the span between heartbeats. Evelyn rushed between them and stepped into the brittle geometry of danger. She was not daft enough to think her body would stop a blade, but she knew something older than method, presence. She felt the wolf's muzzle near her hair, the warmth and the breath that smelled like pine and iron. Under the blood moon, Alaric's fury needed an outlet, and his wolf side wanted the final syllable of slaughter. Instead, it found the thin, miraculous thing of a woman standing in the line between punishment and mercy. She seized the sheriff's arm with the bluntness of practical action. "Put down your weapon," she said, voice more iron than anyone expected. "You will not have him, not like this." Reed was a man of protocols. The command to lower his weapon found its place in his throat like a stone, and he paused, eyes full of the kind of calculation that can be rewritten. Some part of the town's training stayed with him. Suspicion, yes, but also the capacity for human decision when presented with a human face and a trembling hand. He let his sword lower by millimeters. It was enough for Alaric to see the human face reflected in the blade and remember that there was a price he could pay outside of blood. The revenants, bereft of the court's full control, faltered, and Alaric, as if pulled by string, howled a thing that was wolf and man and plea. He staggered, half collapsed into the snow, the moonlight painting him both pitiful and terrible. He had slain enough to create an emptiness that felt like a wound in the valley itself. Evelyn knelt beside him, pressing a palm to his flank, where the silver still cooled like a coin from a lost republic. The sheriff watched, his jaw moving as if forming a new law. Mercy can be an act of courage. Far above, the hollowed court's watchers felt the shift, and in their terrace of ash and stone, set iron and ritual to a darker course. They had not expected a widow to wedge herself into fate and rewrite clauses with the blunt instrument of love. But the world unspooled in ways their parchments could not always anticipate. Evelyn's presence steadied something fragile in Alaric. He looked at her with eyes that were human and burning. "I cannot make this right," he said, breath fogging. Snow crept along his lashes like the white of a ledger. "I am tired." "You are not the ledger," she replied, a simplicity the world had not valued until it crossed the clearing like sunlight. "You are a man who remembered wrong and is trying to do better." For a heartbeat, the valley held its breath. Then something older than law, the need to preserve what is living, folded into the sheriff's understanding. He lowered his weapon fully, and the revenants dissolved into the trees like smoke losing shape. The clearing's silence was broken by the distant drip of snow from branches and by Alaric's harsh, lonely breath, the kind that belonged to someone who had been awake to grief for too long. Evelyn stayed on her knees in the snow, not because she thought it noble, but because she could not do otherwise. She wrapped a spare cloak around his shoulders and felt the small shudder of his shoulders under the weight. In that immediate act, something unspoken passed between them. A slender, crucial trust, built from bandages and dangerous decisions, from the cheap courage of a woman who refused to allow law to be the only god in a winter of fear. They returned to the town slow as confession, leaving the hollow that had been stained, and in their wake, the print of a story that would not be told simply. The valley's night kept its secret, but the echoes ran like river water, reshaping banks. This was not yet an end, and it left more to be accounted for than a single man could shoulder. When the hollowed court felt the ripple reach their stones, they murmured in a language like dry leaves. Mercy had intruded where the court expected obedience, and so their next response would be not merely punitive, but ceremonial. A decision made by old men who had grown used to finishing sentences with fire. They fled from tenderness because their law had been forged in the absence of it. Evelyn did not know yet that the court called for silver fire. She only knew that Alaric's ribs moved under her touch and that the snow tasted like a promise and a nightmare braided together. The next morning would bring summons and judgment. Tonight, they had survived the blood in the snow. Tonight, a woman and a wounded man walked back into a town that would soon decide whether their bond was treason or salvation. The hollowed court convened in a ring of ash beneath a sky that seemed to keep its own counsel. They wore their decisions like cloaks, heavy and trimmed with the sternness of ancient precedent. Their faces were drawn with the lines of people used to rehearsing cruelty into institutional action. Rumor had reached them like a damp wind. The moonbound had been seen, had fought, had been spared by a human's intervention. It did not take them long to call the measure what they feared: contagion. They did not deliberate long. Their magic was not sentimental. It moved like economy and the arithmetic of old bargains. They summoned silver fire, an old element of their law. A flame that consumed the wolf within and left the human with the price of mortality, or, if the creature resisted, with nothing at all. The ritual required a bargain, ancient words spoken into the ash, and the calling down of a force that did not know mercy. The court pronounced judgment with a dryness that would have made a blade seem warm. Evelyn stood at the town's square under the hollow stare of those who believed themselves arbiters of fate. Alaric knelt in front of the court, his shoulders bowed not entirely with submission, but with a tiredness that read like confession. The snow underfoot gleamed with the memory of last night's blood. For the first time since he'd come into town, Alaric looked small in a way that was not noble, but honest. The court's eldest rose and began the invocation. His voice was the voice that had always been used to close wounds by force. Silver sparks gathered and hung like cold stars. The spell was a thing of bright geometry, precise and cruel, the sort of beauty that does not know tenderness. The magic tilted the air and the wind held its breath. Evelyn felt something uncoil in her like anger made into muscle. She could see the arc of their ritual and how it had the comforting clarity of law, remove the danger, restore balance, but also the terrifying simplicity of erasure. She thought of the man who had held her hand, who had bled under her roof, who had known regret like a constant companion. The court's remedy did not feel like justice. It felt like an eraser sweeping a history into nothing. That night had not belonged to an old ledger. It had belonged to a man and to a woman who had chosen to keep him safe. She stepped forward without calculating the risk, because calculation felt like cowardice compared with the price that would be paid. "Stop," she said, and the single word fell into the circle with the force of a small defiance. The court's eldest, his face a map of old conclusions, looked at her with an expression reserved for those who infringe upon authority. "He has broken the pact," the elder intoned, voice like scraped paper. "Balance must be restored." She placed herself between Alaric and the silver fire. The cold met her face like a hand, and she felt the town's eyes weigh her as if she were a woman being measured for a new kind of condemnation. "He's not the monster," she said, voice steady though her limbs felt the tremble. "Your curse made him the thing you fear. You offered punishment as answer. I ask you, what does punishment repair?" There was a small, impossible pause like a held breath. The elders muttered between themselves, their inked parchments fluttering as if turned by an unseen wind. The ritual's geometry wavered for the first time. From the hush, a voice came that trembled through the square like something remembered incorrectly at first. It was soft as fog and old as river bottom. The elder guarding the rites fell to his knees, hand over his heart. "Lady Selene," someone whispered, an invocation that tasted like reverence and dread. The name had been a lullaby in the valley once. She had been a spirit of bargains and tide turns, a remnant of a world that balanced on softer things. The air pulsed, and where the cobbles met the snow, a figure began to form, not entirely flesh, not entirely smoke. Lady Selene took the shape of a woman with hair like moonlight and eyes like the underside of autumn leaves. Her voice, when she spoke, was like water over stones. "You misread the pact," she said, each word a cool hand. It was not meant to be an instrument of erasure. It was a binding to teach, not to execute. The hollowed court bristled at the intrusion, as if offended by the presence of a truth they had not authored. "The pact," one elder began, but Selene lifted her hand and the sentence stopped like a struck note. "The curse was meant to steward memory," she said, and the air smelled of fresh rain. "Not to absolve or to end. It required a lesson and a mending. It asked for a price, yes, but not the extinguishing of what still seeks redemption." Their silver fire flared, impatient and geometrical, but Selene's presence changed its angle. Her eyes found Evelyn and Alaric and softened around them as if seeing a filament of mercy. "There is another way," she said. "A way the court has forgotten. It is not law but gift. Only love freely given can break the binding without condemnation. Not coerced affection, not a ritual of trickery, but the truth of choice. A pledge made without demand can alter the loop the pact has become." The square held a collective intake of breath. The hollowed court's hands twitched, as if reaching for parchments that might not cover this kind of contingency. The court's oldest looked at Selene with a mixture of ancient anger and a new fear. Their rituals did not encompass love as instrument. Evelyn heard the words and felt them map along her skin like a pattern memorized. Love freely given. It was not something the court could command with ink and ash. It was a human transaction of heart, messy and unquantifiable. She looked at Alaric, who knelt with the hollow of exhaustion in him, a man who had been hounded by his own memory and by men who thought themselves architects of consequence. She thought of the silver bullet and the burn it made on his side. She thought of how he had risked the town for her in the snow. She stepped forward into that space of choice where law met a woman's stubborn mercy. "If there is a way to free him that is not treason," she said, voice white and clear, "then tell me what it costs. I will pay it." Selene's mouth curved, almost imperceptibly, with something like approval. "The pact bends when the heart offers itself without command. A sacrifice may be required, but it must be willingly given. It must be a trade that is not demanded by law." The hollowed court, whose decisions had always pleased themselves by being unambiguous, found ambiguity a poor cloth to wear. They could either condemn love as an instrument and risk the pact's fracturing, or they could accept a different currency. The murmurs among the elders were not comfortable. They were not supposed to be. But in that pause, in that small fracture of authority, Alaric rose and faced Evelyn with a slow, solemn movement. He had been a man who had led, who had erred and been punished, who had been bound to remember. The silver fire hovered like a question over his head. He looked at her as if measuring the cost of every kindness she had given him, the bandages, the hidden cellar, the touch at the clearing. Then he did a thing that stunned everyone more than any blade could. He knelt before her properly, like one man before another, and bowed his head. "I will give what the pact demands if it will keep you safe," he said, voice a thread of iron. "If there is a price I must pay that will not be paid with another's blood, I will make it mine." Evelyn felt the world narrow to that sentence, like a breath held at the apex of the dive. She did not want him to die. She did not want to be the cause of any man's end. But Selene's words had stated a rule. The bargain must be voluntarily offered, not demanded. The choice had to be his to make. Alaric raised his eyes, and in them there was a tiredness that made his face seem older than it should be, and a courage that had nothing to do with the violence he could command. "I will give up what keeps me bound to memory," he said. "I offer my immortality. I unshackle myself from the endless ledger. Take the curse from me. Let it burn from my blood if that will close the wound between the wild and the town." The court recoiled as if he had offered a surety too large for their ledgers. To give immortality was to break a law they had never fully tested. It was to convert the pact's punishment into a mortal's gift. Seleni's face softened as if a deep tide had finally folded back. "Then so be it," she said. Silver fire rose like a slow, terrible bloom, measured and indifferent. It licked at Alaric's shadow and did not remove him. Instead, it burned the wolf edges, fur and snout and the long-tilted hunger. The flame did not devour the man. It consumed the thing that had been used against the town. Where the wolf had been braided to bone, a human silhouette remained, small and mortal and raw. The pain was a sound Alaric could not stifle. Evelyn wrapped her arms around him and felt the convulsions like tremors she could soothe, but not halt. When the last of the silver winked out into ashes that smelled like old paper and rain, Alaric sagged in her arms. He was human in a way that admitted the ache of living without armor. His breaths came ragged and honest. The bullet's cold that had haunted him remained as a bruise without its lethal hush. The pact had been altered through his choice. Memory remained, but was no longer a sentence that extended eternity. Dawn found them in the square, wrapped in the town's pallid light. People peered from windows, from doors half open, searching faces for what had been done. Evelyn held him like someone who had sown a tear and then held on until the edges did not fray. He looked at her with eyes that had learned a new vocabulary. "You were never too old for love," she whispered, to a man who had been called too ancient by his own fate. He smiled, small and astonishing, feeling the weight of his mortality like a second skin. "But I was never too late for it either," he answered, voice a raw thing smoothed by dawn. Their hands found each other's in a grip that had nothing to do with law and everything to do with choice. The hollowed court muttered and folded their papers. Lady Selene watched like a tide that had been turned by wind. Grayfen breathed, uneasy and changed. The valley had been rewritten by the rarest of currencies. A voluntary sacrifice and a woman's stubborn heart snow melted into memory and spring, mended what winter had teased apart. Grayfen, which had folded its shutters and whispered prayers a month before, opened its doors again with the slow awkwardness of people trying to remember how to be neighbors. Men nailed new slats where torches had scarred fences. Children ran errands that were no longer hush-practiced. Their laughter was a small, defiant drum. The inn hung fresh linen on its line, and the baker learned that customers were hungrier for more than bread. They wanted proof that the world could still turn without calamity at the hinge. Evelyn returned to the rhythm she knew best. The thrum of her sewing machine, the sharp smell of starch and soap, the small arithmetic of seams. She lined up collars like little sentries on her work table and taught her hands to do what they had always done, to coax broken edges back into a kind of beauty. The town gave her work because she gave it back well. She mended what hands put out and hearts sometimes left in tatters. There was a new brightness in her doorway, a lantern whose glass caught the dawn and held it like a promise. People noticed the way her shoulders relaxed more easily. Some thought it was the passing of danger. Others said love had its own method of repair. Alaric kept quiet company with the town. He learned the language of small civility, to fetch water without drama, to sweep before he sat, to refuse heroics in public and accept tasks that required nothing but steadiness. He did not wear his history like a banner. Instead, he carried it like a patchwork, visible only when the light hit at a certain angle. He worked at the edges of the town, where hedgerows met field, and taught the children which paths bent toward quicksand and which trees bore good fruit. He taught hunters where the boundary ought to be drawn and how to respect it without imposing death as the only solution. In that way, he protected them, not as a predator, but as someone who had learned when the blade was worse than the wound. Sometimes, in the gray early hours before the town had lifted its shutters, people would say they saw a shadow on the old ridge. It was only ever a suggestion at first, a hunched shape that watched the valley like a silhouette in a prayer. Farmers swore their flocks stopped being startled and grazed with fewer jolts. The hedgerow seemed to thicken around the borders where children walked home. Mothers tucked little silver trinkets into pockets, and old women crossed themselves with the same motion they had used before the hollowed court's intervention. Rumor is a faithful tailor. It sews new garments for old fears, and so the story of a guardian wolf found new collars in the mouths of people who liked a tidy moral. Evelyn would press her palm to the window each morning and feel a warmth by the pane, a heat that was less a thing of sunlight and more an imprint of company. On some mornings, she would look up and find him there, Alaric on the ridge, watching the town with a small, private vigilance. He would catch her eye and raise a hand, not a great gesture of possession, but a human signal of hello. At times he walked the lanes at night, carrying a lantern, checking on doors, returning stray animals, helping mend fences torn in storms. He slept more deeply than he ever had, but sometimes he woke with the old ache threaded through his chest, and Evelyn would find him at the kitchen table in the soft hour before dawn, hands braced on the wood. She would bring him tea and fold her fingers into his, and neither would speak of the ledger that had almost been his life. The forest, too, learned a new tune. It was not that the wild contented itself and vanished. Wolves still moved in the deep dark, and foxes kept their guarded covenants. But the trees seemed less restless. The underbrush hummed with something like permission rather than constant siege. Where once a scent had smudged alarms and people had locked doors tighter, the air now carried a different whisper, the hollow echoes of a bargain rephrased. People who had once spent nights watching windows now walked paths with a lighter step. Trust, fragile and slow, grew like a mushroom under the leaf litter. Not decorative, but useful, multiplying where conditions allowed. Yet the valley did not forget in full. There remained at the thin edge of belief the tale of a silver-eyed shape that had patrolled the ridgelines. Teenagers dared one another to cross the hollow at night. Shopkeepers changed their stories to entertain tourists in passing seasons. Love and fear are old companions. Where one softens, the other keeps watch, convalescent and cautious. Evelyn accepted the rumors as one accepts weather, a detail that mattered less than the small, ordinary mercies that formed her days. In the hush of morning, when the world felt remade and private, she would sit by the window, needle poised, and watch the ridge. Sometimes it was a man, sometimes it was the memory of a wolf in silhouette, sometimes it was both. She learned to like the ambiguity. It was a kind of mercy to not know everything at once. That mercy found its way into her dreams as tenderness and as truth. She dreamed often of a field of low mist where everything softened at the edges. In that dream, Alaric stood before her not as a man marked by timber and time, but with the clear, open face of someone newly unarmored. He smiled the way a horizon relaxes when morning comes, small, inevitable, gently warming. There was no rawness in him now. The scars that remembered the old ledger lay beneath skin like faint tributaries, present but not proclaimed. "You made me remember who I was," he said in the dream, and his voice settled like a stone warmed in the sun. It was not cast as confession so much as ascription, a definition given back to him, precise and soft. Not an alpha, not a beast, just a man who loved you. His words were not a proclamation of salvation so much as an inventory of what the act of loving had done. It had stripped away titles that bound him to other people's memory and returned him to a smaller, truer identity. In the dream, he reached out and smoothed the thread at the cuff of her sleeve with a gentleness that had been earned in blood and snow. She felt the weight of that care and the absurd, quiet joy of being seen without the ledger that had shadowed him. Waking from that dream, Evelyn would hold the echo of his smile like a warm pebble. The ordinary tasks of the day, a hem to be fastened, a child's coat to be mended, carried the echo with them. There was a new vocabulary in the town for tenderness. No grand gestures, but 1,000 small acts that added to a life like stitches on a quilt. They were not dramatic, nor did they announce themselves in great trumpets. They existed, as most important things do, in the gentle press of routine. Years unrolled with the benign cruelty of calendars. Evelyn grew older in a way that suited her. Hair threaded with silver at the temple, laugh lines deepening like familiar seams. Her hands still knew how to make holes invisible, and gavellings seem brand new. Alaric kept his quiet watch, his sleep less haunted by endless memory and more by the regular cares of living, aches in joints, the odd worry about the town's well, a tender preoccupation with whether the hedgerow needed reinforcement. They lived in the house by the road's last curve, and their lives stitched together in a fabric that, though patched in places, kept them warm. One harvest season, a child wandered from the path between two fields and became lost in the tangle where blackthorns clustered like secrets. The town organized a small search, Voices called, lanterns bobbed, feet scuffed. Panic has a way of making small things into avalanches, but a girl returned hours later, eyes wide with the sort of awe unlikely to be born from simple rescue. "I saw a silver-eyed wolf," she told the gathered crowd, and the words landed like a small coin thrown in a well. "It came and watched me. It stood on a rock and looked at me with eyes like the moon. It walked in front of me and led me out of the thicket." The child described the creature not with the tremor of fear, but with the reverence of one who had met a guardian angel wearing fur. She insisted that it had not harmed her. She claimed it had nudged her gently with a muzzle and then looked back like it had a promise to keep. The townspeople listened with the mixture of skepticism and wonder that the human heart keeps like a secret drawer. Some smiled and said the child had been frightened and made up a friend. Others crossed themselves. The old women nodded, and the baker announced, for reasons that had nothing to do with superstition and everything to do with comfort, that he had made a special loaf for those who had been lost and found. Evelyn, older now, felt the story as a warmth that was both memory and present tense. She lit a lamp each full moon and set it in the window, a small beacon to the ridge and to habits that needed honoring. The lantern was not a plea so much as a ritual. She said the words aloud sometimes, as if talking into the dark might make the world kinder. "Rest easy, my love," she would whisper, and the sound sat like a benediction in the rafters. "You still protect us." Sometimes the wind answered with a low, single howl that came from the hills and seemed to roll and soften like distant laughter. It was mournful and content at once, a sound that held both the ache of what had been and the satisfaction of what was now. Whether the cry belonged to a wolf, or to memory, or to a man walking a ridge at night, the town did not always agree. It made no matter to Evelyn. She had learned to let certain truths live as stories do, ambiguous, multiple, and generous in the telling. When the light broke across the valley in the slow authority of dawn, she often imagined Alaric sitting where the world opened to the field, his shape a modest sentinel. Whether he stood and watched as a man or left the country to a guardian spirit in whose form she had once seen teeth and mercy was a distinction she let the world keep. The pact had been altered. The cost had been paid in a way that was not merely the extinguishing of a life, but the willing acceptance of mortality. That choice had shaped the valley differently. The wilds kept their secrets, and the town its softness. Evelyn lived her days with the quiet fullness of someone who had seen and survived a great ledger of loss, and had learned how to bind it with thread. She taught the children the names of herbs and how to stitch a hem straight. She laughed on market days and haggled politely for onions. Each full moon she put out the lantern and whispered into the trees, and sometimes the wind would answer with that single low, contented howl. The last time she walked to the window at dusk she was older still, her hands a map of years, her eyes steady like stained glass warmed by memory. She placed her palm to the glass and felt the faint warmth that always accompanied the ridge's silhouette. "Rest easy," she said, to a man, a promise, and to the valley itself. The wind took it up and carried it over hedgerow and field. From the hills came back a sound, a note that had been sharpened by winter, soothed by spring, tempered by the slow work of repair. It was not the end of wildness in the valley. It was a translation. The moon slid back into dawn, and the town, the forest, and the man who had once been bound to forever found a new cadence. They had traded a curse for a choice, and in that exchange had altered the grammar of how they kept watch over one another. Love had not erased the past, nor had it made suffering simple, but it had reworded the covenant. Where fear had once written the rules, mercy now traced the margins. A single low howl rose once more into the light, mournful, content, and eternal, and Evelyn smiled as the first sun touched the hem of her curtain. She returned to her sewing, to the things that stitch worlds together in small, patient motions, carrying in her chest the proof that vows made with a free heart can change the story a valley tells about itself.